and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to upgrade or replace the stock PCIe SSD in a 2013 27-inch iMac. Replacing the PCIe SSD in these iMacs is an advanced installation with a risk of damage to your screen. It's highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. If you're unsure about completing this installation yourself, professional installation is available. We've already backed up our data, gathered our materials, shut down and unplugged the iMac, and are working on a soft static-free work surface. We're now ready to begin. The first thing we need to do is remove the display of the iMac. It's held in place with an adhesive around the edges, which you'll have to cut apart. This can be a tricky process and runs a risk of cracking the display, so you'll need to be very careful. Starting on one of the lower corners, insert the screen removal tool between the glass and the chassis. Take care not to put too much stress on the glass itself, or it may crack. Work along all the edges of the iMac. All we're doing is cutting the tape holding the display on, not prying the glass away. The corners may be a little tricky, so you may need to go over them a couple of times. The process may take a little time, so be patient. Once you've worked your way all the way around, you can lay the computer face up on your work surface and attach the suction cups to the upper corners. Do one last check to make sure you've loosened all the adhesive around the edges of the iMac. Then lift the glass partway up using the suction cups. Inside, near the top of the right speaker, you'll need to detach two cables. For the first, simply slide it out of its socket. For the second cable, first lift up on the metal handle to unlock the connector, then slide it out. You can then angle the display the rest of the way up and remove the adhesive holding the bottom of the display. Simply grab the tab on each side of the adhesive strip and slowly pull it towards the center until it comes free. Finally, use your opening tool to slit the last little bit of adhesive along the center, and you should be able to remove the display and set it aside. Now's a good time to peel up any residual adhesive that remains on the iMac chassis so we can replace it with new adhesive later. Then, do the same for any adhesive on the back of the display. The PCIe SSD is located on the back of the main logic board. In order to reach it, we'll need to remove much of the iMac's internals. First, we'll start with a strip along the lip of the iMac, which is held in by 9 small Phillips screws, which we need to remove. You should then be able to slide the piece out of the iMac. Next, we'll move on to the left speaker. Start by loosening the 2 Torx T10 screws holding it in place. Slide the speaker cable from its socket, then pull the cable up and out of its channel next to the hard drive. Then, unplug the power button cable from the power supply board. Pull the speaker assembly slightly out of the iMac so that you can remove the power button cable from its channel along the speaker unit. You can then remove the speaker completely. Next is the hard drive. Remove the two Torx T10 screws holding in the outer bracket of the hard drive. This should allow you to slide the drive and bracket out of the bracket on the other side. Once you've done that, you can lift the drive up slightly and detach it from the SATA cable, allowing you to remove it completely. Next, we'll remove the fan, which is held in by these three Torx T10 screws. Remove these screws, then disconnect the fan cable by sliding its connector from its socket. Lift up on the fan, slowly peeling it from the tape securing it to the heatsink, then set it aside. Moving on to the right speaker, loosen its two Torx T10 screws, and disconnect the speaker cable much like we did with the left one. Make sure the speaker cable isn't caught on anything on the underside of the logic board, and you should then be able to remove the speaker unit completely. For the power board, we first need to remove the power supply signal cable by sliding its connectors from their slots. Then, remove these four Torx T10 screws. You should now be able to pull the power board forward slightly and up so you can disconnect this larger power connector. There's a small latch on the underside which you'll need to push in order to release it. There is one last cable to disconnect, located on the underside of the power board. Press down on the latch of its connector and slide it out. You can now set the power board aside. Now it's time to disconnect the airport and Bluetooth cables from the board. In order to keep them in the right order when it's time to reassemble your iMac, place a small piece of tape across all four, holding them in place. You can then carefully disconnect the snap connectors that attach the airport and Bluetooth cables to the logic board. Disconnect the camera cable by lifting up on the metal latch, then sliding the connector out of its socket. The headphone connector simply lifts up and off its socket. Now we can remove the 6 Torx T10 screws holding the board in place, along with loosening the small captured one underneath the board. Next, we need to remove these two T10s holding the heatsink to the chassis. Finally, remove this Torx T25 post. Remove the SATA cable from under the hard drive bracket and you should now be able to remove the main logic board from the iMac. The SSD module is located here, near the I/O ports. To remove the original drive, first remove its Torx T8 retaining screw. Then, slide the drive out of its socket. The new drive will have a notch in its connector. This will line up with a pin in the PCIe SSD slot. Slide the drive into its slot until it's fully seated. Then secure it with its Torx T8 screw. Now we're ready to replace the logic board back into the iMac. Located near the I/O ports are two pins. These two pins line up with these two slots in the iMac's chassis to help align the board when replacing it. Replace the logic board into the iMac, taking care not to trap any cables underneath. The pins and slots shown earlier will help indicate when the board is properly positioned. Once it is, slide the SATA cable underneath the hard drive bracket and we can reattach the board to the iMac. Start with the large Torx T25 post along the side. You can then replace the two Torx T10 screws to hold the heatsink in place. Next, tighten the captive screw located through the hole in the logic board. You can then replace the 6 Torx T10 screws that hold the logic board in place. 3 of the shorter screws go in the 3 holes nearest the lip of the iMac. With the last short screw going on the outermost hole near the antenna connectors. The remaining 2 holes get the longer screws. Now we can reconnect all the cables to the logic board. For the headphone cable, simply align the 2 connectors and snap them together. Slide the camera cable into its socket, then use the metal bar to latch it into place. Arrange the Bluetooth and airport antenna cables over their connectors. The tape should have kept them in the right order. Then, snap the connectors together by pushing them straight down. Plug the smaller power supply cable near the Apple logo into its socket on the underside of the power supply. Next, attach the larger power cable to the socket that's on the underside of the logic board. You can now set the power board back into the iMac so that it lays flat and secure it with its 4 Torx T10 screws. The 2 longer screws go along the innermost edge and the 2 shorter ones go near the lip of the iMac. Finally, slide the power supply signal cables connectors into their sockets and we're ready to move on to the right speaker. Set the speaker into place, making sure the speaker cable routes alongside it but is still accessible. Secure the speaker assembly by tightening its two Torx T10 screws and finally slide the connector itself into its socket. Next, set the fan into place, making sure it goes underneath the piece of tape hanging off the heatsink. Secure it with its three Torx T10 screws and press down on the tape to seal it to the fan. There should be enough residual adhesive to allow it to stick. Finally, slide the fan connector into its socket. Align the SATA connection on your drive with the one on the iMac's cable and slide the two together. Fit the two pins on the side of the drive into the two holes in the bracket. You can then secure the bracket on the other side using its two Torx T10 screws. Set the left speaker partially into place so that just the narrow end is under the lip. There's a groove along the speaker assembly at this point where we need to route the power button cable. The solid wrap portion of the cable goes in the groove that runs along the face of the speaker assembly. And then the twisted wires go in the groove along the side. You can now move the speaker into place. This will allow you to slide the power button cable's connector into its socket. Route the speaker cable behind the hard drive and slide the cable's connector into its socket on the logic board. You can now tighten the speaker's two Torx T10 screws. The last thing to replace is the strip along the bottom lip of the iMac. Take one of the Phillips screws and attach one of the corners, rotating the strip into place as you tighten the screw. Then, use the remaining screws to secure the other points. We're now ready to close up. Set the tape pieces in place according to the diagram that comes with your kit. You'll know they're positioned correctly if all the holes and cutouts line up with the shape of the iMac chassis. Once you've determined all the pieces of tape have been placed correctly, peel off the backing and adhere them to their places on the iMac. You can help line it up easier by inserting a pointed object through the hole in the tape and using it to line the tape up with the corresponding hole in the iMac's chassis. You can then peel off the backing on the other side to expose the adhesive that will attach the display. Set the display along the bottom edge, as flush with the lip and as centered as possible, but don't let it close yet, as we need to reconnect the last two cables. Reattach the video cable by sliding the connector into its socket and locking it into place with the handle. Then, simply slide the last connector into its socket. You can now carefully lower the display into place, making sure you have the edges lined up correctly. Gently squeeze along the edges to make sure the adhesive sticks. Use the microfiber cloth to avoid any extra fingerprints. You can now remove the suction cups and clean any remaining marks off your iMac. You can now plug your iMac back in, hook it up, and turn it on.